Welcome to Staying Connected, a podcast where I talk to people about their stories with VEDS, Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, and related vascular and aortic connective tissue conditions. The views, information, and opinions in this podcast are those of the individuals involved, and the information presented does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Welcome back. Today, we're going to hear from Melanie Case, who was diagnosed with Marfan syndrome in 2002, a couple years after she had a thoracic aortic dissection following the delivery of her second child. This aortic dissection went undiagnosed for about 2 years, and after it was discovered, it led to her diagnosis with Marfan syndrome. If you like this show and you want to help our communities raise awareness of VEDS, Marfan, and Loeys-Dietz, you can buy merch, including tote bags and t-shirts, in my Printify pop-up store, or you can support the show by joining my Patreon. This show wouldn't be possible without the continued support of my Patreon subscribers, so if you've already been supporting the show, thank you. Let's get into the interview. Hey Melanie, thank you so much for joining me to share your story with Marfan syndrome. Do you want to introduce yourself for everybody that doesn't know you?
Yes, I'm Melanie Case. I have Marfan syndrome, obviously since birth, but to get diagnosed and find everything out, it was quite a long story. And I really appreciate you having your podcast so all of us can share our stories and people can be thinking about maybe people in their family or people they know that might be having some similar experiences, and then they could investigate a little bit further and maybe find out things more preventatively.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to do it, and I really hope that your story helps diagnose somebody or helps somebody in their own journey with this. When did Marfan syndrome come into your life? When were you diagnosed with that?
So it was almost 25 years ago. I had one pregnancy that went completely fine. And a couple years later, I delivered our second son, and I was in the hospital, and I had gotten up to nurse him that night. And I was putting him back down in his crib in the hospital. And all of a sudden I felt this knife, like a knife. And it was like an experience that was through all of my senses. Like I felt it. It was almost like I heard it. And it was the most excruciating pain I had ever experienced. And I had just delivered a baby.
Yeah.
So, and it kind of took all of the wind out of me. I was just like, ugh, like how you would imagine getting stabbed in the back. And my husband had gone home to be with our toddler who was home. And my mom was spending the first night in the hospital with me. And I didn't have anything on my radar that was heart related, but just instinctively, I was like, oh my God, Mom, I just felt like something stabbed me in the back, and I think it's my heart. And I don't even know where that came from. But so we were trying to page the nurses and, just to tell them what was going on. And nobody was answering the call. It was almost like this Twilight Zone. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. This hurts so bad. So I actually called my OBGYN in the middle of the night and, got the paging person, and then they put me through to him, and I told him what was going on. And he didn't tell me this at the time, but so some lab people came in and they did this special test. Later, I learned it was to check to see if I had a blood clot in my lungs. And I was sitting in the recliner holding the baby, and the guy was just looking at me in the eyes, and I don't know, I must have been in shock or something, because he was like, this is going to hurt like heck. And he stabbed this needle in my wrist, the underside of my wrist, to do whatever test that was. I don't even remember feeling it. I was just like, oh, it hurt so bad. That came back negative, and the doctor saw me the next morning, and he said, I think that you just strained your back during labor. So he had the nurses massage my back and ice my back. And I mean, the pain did subside, and I got discharged with the baby. So I was home off work for, several weeks, with the new baby at home. And it's crazy how naive you are when you're young.
Yeah.
I was just like, I guess I'd never strained a muscle. So I'm like, I guess this is what it is. It's like to strain a muscle. So I would get up at night and feed the baby. And after I would put him down for, to go back to bed, I would just get in the shower and have the shower head pulsating on my back to try to get some of that pain down. And I would be crying but not once did I think, oh, I should have this looked at further. But when I went to one of my postpartum checkups, the doctor was like, oh, how's your back doing? And I'm like, well, it's still there, but it's getting better. So, but I am really tired. And that was one thing I noticed, chasing my toddler around, carrying the baby. I'm like, wow, I am so tired. But I didn't put two and two together. It wasn't until, so that was in June of 1999. In February of 2002, I went to see my regular doctor just for a checkup. And I had mentioned to her that when I was around middle school, they noticed a heart murmur that ended up being a mitral valve prolapse. And they're like, oh, that happens to a lot of people. Just get an echo periodically. So I mentioned to her that I hadn't had an echo since before I had my first child. And I asked, should I have that done? And she said, you're really healthy. I don't see a reason, but if you really want it, I'll order it. So I was like, well, maybe we should order it. So a few weeks later, I had that test done. And it was one of those magical days where it's just like a beautiful day. And you're like, man, everything's right with my world. But then when I got home, my husband was just like in such shock. And I was like, what's wrong? And he's like, your doctor just called and she said your aorta's falling apart. And I'm like, what? I mean, and not being a medical person, I was really feeling very nonchalant about it. I was like, here it is, 2002. The doctors can fix anything. So I talked to her later that evening. She explained it further, and I still didn't understand the gravity of it. So I went in for the CT scan, and that's when, everything just went crazy. The doctors thought that it was just happening, and they got me up with some surgeons in a bigger town about 30 miles away in Olympia. And I walk in, and I'm still being very lighthearted and not thinking this is anything super serious. And he looks at me and he said, have you ever heard of Marfan syndrome? And I was like, well, when I was in middle school, they found this heart murmur and they questioned whether I had it, but they did some tests and they said, oh, you don't have it. And he's like, well, you don't really look like you have it, but it's so rare for someone so young. At this point, I was in my early 30s to have something like this happen. And then he started spouting off, well, we're going to have to do surgery. It's going to be unusual to find someone who's done surgery on someone so young. And you have like a 15 or 20% chance of dying on the table. So when he said that in the office, I almost fainted because here I had a baby and a 2-year-old. And I just could not imagine leaving them. So I literally had to lie down on the table in the doctor's office. And luckily my husband was there and, he got me calmed down and everything. And the doctor was like, we're going to do this, do that, blah, blah, blah. But luckily something in his mind, and he also asked, have you ever had like a really bad pain in your chest, in your back, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, almost 2 years ago, when I had my second baby, this is what happened. And he was like, I really have a feeling this is what happened. You had a dissection that wasn't like right where your aorta comes out of your heart, but it's in the thoracic region, which is kind of where your shoulder blades are, like that middle area. all the way down to your iliac artery or your iliacs, the top of your legs. And someone was really watching out for you because for your body to have gotten through that shock and then, I mean, not that it healed itself, but it just kind of stopped at that point and didn't let it progress further. Mm-hmm. And that's when I started learning and understanding how serious this all was.
Yeah.
So something in his mind made him put the brakes on. He's like, if this happened 2 years ago, maybe this is stable. And as I was learning about all this, he explained that if it is stable and this has happened 2 years ago, this area is typically treated medically because it's such a tricky part to get at. There's so many arteries that come off or vessels that come off the aorta. At that point, there's the risk of paralysis and all this other scary stuff that I didn't really want to think about. So he decided to do a repeat CT scan in 2 weeks. So I was told to go home and take it easy. And oh my gosh, with 2 babies, that was super hard. But I was kind of a basket case too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we would spend our Saturday mornings, everyone just snuggling in bed because all of this really puts life in perspective to you about what is super important and just loving on my babies and my husband was really what life was all about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he did a 2-week CT scan and then he started moving it out. So at 2 weeks, there was absolutely no changes from when it was first found. And then he decided to move it to 1 month and then another month. So in this meantime, when things were getting stretched out on the CT scans, he talked to my primary care physician and said, I don't think this just happened. I think this is probably related to a genetic condition. So she got me in with the UW genetics team. So about a month later, our whole family went up to see Dr. Byers. And the whole ride up there, I was just like praying I didn't have it. I didn't want to have a genetic condition. But then on the other hand, I did want a reason, like why did this happen to me so young? So this was before they had a blood test. And it's so nice now that there's a blood test that can pinpoint Marfan and a lot of these other connective tissue disorders. So Dr. Byers walks in and he's like, well, Melanie, you have Marfan syndrome. I mean, he just looked at me and he's like, by looking at you and what happened to you in your CT scan and everything, yes, you have Marfan syndrome. And he also evaluated Eric, my husband, and our sons. And as a mom, I noticed the difference in our sons. One was pretty sturdy and he was, tall and everything for his age because he comes by it naturally. My husband's 6'4" and I'm 5'11" and a half. But then our younger son was really kind of floppy and just different. And so he said our other son had it too. And so I just started crying, and Dr. Byers, who I'm sure a lot of people on this podcast know, he is the kindest soul. He just gave me a big hug and he said, this is what makes you beautiful. It's what makes you you. And we have a whole team of great people. We're going to get you in with good cardiologists and good surgeons. And whenever you do have to have surgery, they're going to take the best care of you. And I said, I just want to see my babies graduate from high school. And he said, we'll get you to that point and we'll get you beyond. You'll see them graduate from college and get married and you'll get to see your grandbabies. And I mean, of course, I didn't believe him at the time because there is quite a shock. It does take a lot to get over that initial shock. So it was a lot to get over, or you just come to terms with in your own life. So we saw Dr. Byers, I think it was March in 2002. He gave us a diagnosis, and I hadn't really gotten in with the Marfan Foundation, talked with any people who had also been diagnosed. So I was just I felt super alone. And I mean, my husband was amazing. My parents, my whole family was amazing. But I was afraid to plan our youngest son's birthday. He was going to be turning 3 in June. And there was a period there that I didn't think that I would be around. I just thought it was like so immediate and it was all over. But I mean, luckily, just over time, I mean, I reached out, and this is how long ago this was. They used to have like phone people with the Marfan Foundation that you could call, not Marfan Foundation people, but other people in your area that had that were diagnosed. And so I called a lady, and really all I wanted was some reassurance, and she wasn't super nice. It wasn't what I was looking for. I called her, and she said, "Oh, are you calling me about Marfan syndrome?" And I was like, "Yes." I said, "This is what happened to me, and I just like some reassurance." And I mean, she was able to give me that. So she was probably in her 60s then. Mm-hmm. And she said she had a son who also had Marfan syndrome. And I think maybe he had a daughter who had it as well. And they were all, alive and thriving and things like that. So that was good. But she was like, "Do you know how I knew you had Marfan?" And I was like, "No, I could tell by your voice." And so that was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know we had a certain voice. I don't know.
Yeah, let's pause there. There's so much to unpack there. That is incredible. So you had a thoracic aortic dissection. Like, what was it? You said like 2 weeks after your youngest son was born, or like while you were still in the hospital after your son was born, right?
Right. So, our youngest son was born, and it was a way different delivery than our first son. Our first son, everything was natural. Mm-hmm. Water broke, blah, blah, blah. Got to the hospital, delivered him without any drugs just because it happened so fast. So he was a pretty big baby. So they decided to induce me with our youngest son. And so you always wonder, like, oh, was it this? Was it that? Blah, 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 that helped contribute to the whole dissection situation. But so he was delivered like at maybe 1:30 in the afternoon. And so I would guess it was maybe 12 hours later. Okay. It was that night. That night or early the next morning.
And then 2 years later was when that was diagnosed.
Correct. It was diagnosed. So they didn't diagnose it when I was in the hospital. That's when they just thought I strained my back during labor, and maybe their icing and massaging helped arrest, helped stop it from going any further. I really have no idea.
And this was all 22 years ago that you were diagnosed with Marfan. Now.
Correct.
So you hinted at this, like, this was so long ago that this was my experience with talking with somebody else. This is how the Marfan Foundation used to work, kind of thing. When did you first meet somebody else in person with Marfan syndrome, and when did all of this start to change?
So after the lady on the phone call, I think I found another phone number for someone in Oregon, because we live kind of right between Seattle and Portland. And I reached out to the woman in Oregon, and she was like, I think she had recently gone through having her aortic valve replaced, and she was more than happy to talk to me. We got together at a place to have coffee. I think it was down in the Vancouver area. So we sat and talked for 2 hours, and she was so wonderful and reassuring. She told me about her 2 daughters who also had Marfan syndrome and the challenges that they've gone through with some scoliosis surgeries and also having some valve replacement surgery. But she was a real beacon of hope, because, she backed up what Dr. Byers said. Like, it's manageable. You just have to be good about going to your doctors and keeping up on things. And if there is something that needs to be repaired, you get it repaired, which also my cardiologist, once I saw her for the first time, that's how she was too. She's very matter of fact, very knowledgeable and down to earth, because of course, when you are first learning about something, your mind just runs a mile a minute. So I had a million questions. Well, what if this? What if this? What if this? And she said, Melanie, when things need to get fixed, that's when we fix them. We monitor things until that point. And then when all the other possible things come up, we address them at that time. And you might think of this as, a curse, something bad that happened in your life. But it's in fact a blessing to know, now you know. I mean, unfortunately, I didn't know when I delivered my son, and I had that 2-year period where we're not, I wasn't really getting any medical care about it. But it's a blessing to know, especially for our son. We were able to get him in with Children's Hospital in Seattle at a very young age, and on some beta blocker medicine that would help reduce the force on his aorta. And he's been fortunate enough to be in the atenolol-losartan trial, and being tall. Not all people with Marfan are tall, but a lot of people are. And, even the PE teachers and coaches, knowing that he had it, but maybe they didn't really understand the ramifications. He'd be like, hey, you want to play basketball? And luckily we were able to funnel his energies into music and robotics and things like that, not playing basketball.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's really wonderful. Have you had to have surgery yet on your aorta?
Yes. So when they did diagnose it in 2002, not only did I have a dissection, but at the very top of the dissection, there was an aneurysm. And so when I first got diagnosed, I started visiting with a surgeon just so to keep that relationship open. And then he would let me know, if things were growing and at what point we would consider doing surgery, because he was the one who explained, we'll treat it medically until a certain point, and because we weigh the risks of surgery versus the risks of dissection. And he explained all that. And so I was fortunate enough to put off surgery for 5 years. And then in 2007, I had it, which my anniversary is actually this week. It's June 20th. And it's so funny. So this is my hope for people who are newly diagnosed and they're in that really scared period of time. Usually at the beginning of the year, I get my new calendar, and I'm just a kid at heart. I love filling in all of the special dates like birthdays and everything with markers or colored pencils. And I was like on June, and I'm like, man, June 20th, is that somebody's birthday? I can't really remember what it is. And it didn't dawn on me until I flipped the calendar over this month. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that was the anniversary of my surgery date.
Wow.
So, and usually what I like to do, and I've had a really busy couple of years, helping with parents and things like that. I usually send a letter to my surgeon, and he's retired now. So I'm hoping that someone at the U can get a thank you letter to him. But he was just amazing. And even though surgery is something really daunting to consider, and it's big, because to access your thoracic aorta, they go in through your side. And it was really painful. In preparation for the surgery, Dr. Byers, I asked him, I'm like, well, what's it going to feel like? And he's like, it's going to hurt like nothing you've ever felt, and it's going to keep hurting. But there's going to be one day you're going to be like, oh, it doesn't hurt anymore. But my big thing with my surgeon was I showed him a picture of my boys, one of my favorite pictures. And he wouldn't let me have any anxiety medicine that morning. And because he just wanted the anesthesia to work perfectly. So I'm lying on the table and the surgical team's around me and I'm really scared. And he's like, okay, you can give her some medicine now. But they all gathered around me, and it's that moment when they're getting you off whatever the preparation table is to the other table to go into surgery. They're like, let's get Melanie fixed for, and they said my son's name. So it was kind of like this rally. Let's get her fixed for Melanie's sons. And then, the recovery was pretty hard. I probably took I think I had planned 3 months off work, but maybe I came back at 10 weeks. And it was tough, but my surgeon said, as long as you can get out there and walk, the more you walk, the better recovery you're going to have. And for my kids, it was probably the ideal summer. I had the whole summer off, and once I could drive, we just spent the days at the park or the pool, swimming pool or whatever. And so looking back on it, it was pretty amazing. And, my body healed up, and I have a big scar that looks like a shark bite. So sometimes if I'm not in the mood to talk about it and people ask me at the pool, I'm like, oh yeah, I had a shark bite, and then I laugh or something. But, and other people, I just use it as an opportunity to educate, well, I have Marfan syndrome, and this is one of the complications that can happen.
Yeah. When was so that was 2007. When was the first time that you went to conference?
It was in 2012, and Dr. Byers had always told us how amazing it would be, but it was always really far away, and traveling with young kids was just a bit daunting. And so that year it was in Portland, and I was even a little nervous about going, and I don't really know what it was, just about all these people with Marfan syndrome. I kind of thought it would be a little bit sad, and I don't know. But then the minute we got there, it was so amazing just being in the lobby, and you're like, oh my gosh, all these people you could tell, being tall and thin and long legs. And it was just so amazing. And my son was between the children's program and the teen. He was that was the summer he was turning 12, turning 13. But I thought maybe all the teen things were a bit too teenage for him. So I opted to keep him in the kid program because they were going to the zoo. They were going to OMSI, which he was really super into. And he made this best friend, and it was just really special. And then I became really good friends with the mom, and of course they had to live clear across the country. They live in Maryland. So subsequently I think the next year it was in Chicago. So we planned a huge train trip, and so we ended up making all of our conference destinations a super fun trip, either on the train, or I think one year when it was in Baltimore, we went in early to Baltimore to hang out with our friends and toured Washington, D.C. and, did some really fun stuff like that. So my son and his friend have kept in touch. Now that they're in their early 20s and they've got a little bit out of touch, but they ended up not going every year because we were pretty good about going for several years in a row. So subsequent to that, our older son, who doesn't have Marfan, they have a great group for unaffected siblings. But he ended up making, both of them made this big group of friends where they would keep in touch via Snapchat. And then one of the kids in the group ended up having to have surgery right before one of the conferences. So he wasn't able to go that year. So they were doing these FaceTime videos and letting him know everything he was missing. And they were keeping him in the loop. And so they've all really stayed in touch that way. And it's been really helpful.
Yeah. Going back to, so when you were first diagnosed in 2002, you talked to the second woman that you talked to that was like, you're going to be able to manage it. You just go to your appointments, all that stuff. Is that how you feel now that it's been so many years since you initially got that diagnosis? Like, how has your perception of Marfan syndrome changed over the years since your diagnosis?
So I think when you're very first diagnosed, it's all like right here. It's like all in your face. And it's pretty much 24/7. I mean, I was like trying to research everything. And now, 22 years later, it's pretty much in the back of my mind. The only time I really think about it is if my son has to go for any of his checkups, and I'm kind of worried about him. And now that he's an adult, he gets to make his own decisions, which is challenging. And for me, like, I'll be totally fine. And then if I have an annual checkup, then I get pretty, I'm just like everybody else. I get nervous. And I think that's one of the things that maybe doctors, because they're not us and they're doing their doctor thing, they don't understand that if we have our test one day and then we can't see them for 2 weeks, even though that information might be in our My Chart, it's really scary for us. So I really like my appointments where I can get my test like earlier in the day, and then I see my doctor in person later in the day. That's like the perfect scenario. And I mean, I know when I have to have surgery in the future, it'll be tough just to go down that road again. But I'm so thankful of all of the researchers, all the people that are continuing to research and perfect ways to treat Marfan syndrome, investigating different techniques. And so, I mean, that's how I am now. I pretty much, it's in the back of my mind. And I know the Marfan Foundation has their virtual conference this week, so I'm looking forward to that. And I do look forward to, meeting up with Marfan friends, like for the walk or for symposiums and things like that. But it's kind of in the back of my mind in my everyday scenario. I try to eat healthy. I try to exercise to kind of keep the skeletal aches and pains at bay, and just to keep my cardiovascular health good. But I know I'm not supposed to, go overboard with with it and things like that.
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned the mitral valve prolapse, and when you were evaluated as a child, the doctor that you saw didn't really think that you fit the criteria for Marfan syndrome. Has that changed? And what are the things, because people can't see you in this podcast, what are the features of Marfan syndrome that you have?
Well, so when I was 13 and they were initially looking at me after the mitral valve prolapse, I mean, I was pretty typical Marfan features. I was this height then, so 5'11" and a half, very thin. I was probably like maybe 115 to 120, very flexible. My parents, when they would have friends over, they'd be like, "Oh, Melanie, show people how you can make your arm go, backwards, or your wrist go this way, or your fingers do all this crazy stuff." And I just thought it was fun to do. And my parents never thought that it was, anything to do with a medical condition. I have fairly flat feet. I have stretch marks. I had super crooked teeth. We don't have one of the features is lens dislocation. So our lenses aren't I don't know, there must be certain degrees of dislocation. When the ophthalmologist uses that little magnifying glass to look from the top of our eyes down, she can see that our lenses are a bit off, a bit shaky.
Yeah.
And Dr. Byers says that he can see when he's looking, he can see our lenses shimmer. So he just thinks they're a little bit jiggly.
Oh, that is so
and that's a Dr.
interesting.
Byers thing. Yeah. And I did get they watched me for quite a while when I was, in that big growth spurt phase. I'd say like late elementary through middle school about scoliosis, but I'd never had to wear a brace or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such great information, for anybody listening who has similar features or has someone in their life that has similar features that hasn't been evaluated. And it's, you highlight the range, that some people's lenses are fully dislocated or get fully dislocated, and the scoliosis and things that you didn't have as much. And it's important to remember that it is a range. Did you ever get the blood test later? I know it wasn't available in 2002.
I have not gotten it. They did have both of our sons get the blood test. So our oldest son, it was negative, and then our youngest son did show a mutation in the FBN1 gene. So they're just like, well, you obviously have, that's what you have. So they haven't had me do the blood test, but I don't know. I might bring it up just to say, well, do you want to double check, or could there be anything more that I have? But I think that's what they're thinking.
Yeah. Well, do you have advice for someone else that is just getting diagnosed now?
I wanted to say, now that I'm 22 years out, that's like how I am hoping to give back to the community and people who are newly diagnosed, because it's so easy to feel so alone. And when you're feeling alone, it's just a really scary feeling. And so I hope that I can give hope to people and let them know that if either they, as maybe a parent, are getting diagnosed, that as long as they're getting in with the doctors and following the doctor's recommendations, they'll more than likely be around for their children. And if their children are getting diagnosed, there's so much out there that can help. And we're lucky that, like, if there's people in this community, we live right between Portland and Seattle, and there's good doctors in both places. And the Marfan Foundation is a great resource if people want to go outside of the area too, just to let them know, steer your kids away from the contact sports, the sports where they're going to be pushed beyond their limits. And, there's music, there's robotics, there's our younger son played golf. Golf was a really good alternative for him, and he loves to ride his bike. And our doctors always said, bike riding or PE or things like that, as long as our son is given the option, the teachers or coaches need to just let him say, okay, this is my limit, listen to your body and things like that.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Peter Byers a few times in this. So Peter, if you're listening, thank you for everything that you've done for our community of people with Marfan and VEDS and LDS. What do you want other medical professionals to know about living with Marfan? Ones that maybe aren't in our community.
I think people not in our community, if they just take the time to learn about it, because as you've also done, we've both gone to help out Dr. Sakai with the new medical students, and the medical students have written notes after that are so gracious and kind, just like, I'll never forget the panel of patients who came in to tell us about connective tissue disorders. So just if a patient were to come to them and maybe the doctor hadn't heard about it, if they would be conscientious and look it up and be willing to learn about it. And then doctors that we already work with, just realize that if we are worried about something or if we have a question, it's like almost a feeling of anguish or just deep down fear when we can't talk to our people. And I think they should know that we are respectful of their time, but to wait like 2 weeks to figure something out is, It's the worst.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I want to echo that sentiment of like really liking those days where you get your scan in the morning and then the appointment in the afternoon. Like that has been the best model for that scan anxiety, the scan anxiety. Yeah. In my opinion, that's been the best model because you don't have to wait those 2 weeks.
Yes.
I think that's so important. And then, on the flip side, if you're in my chart and you get your results and you don't have an appointment for 2 weeks and you have something scary on there, that's bad too. Because then you're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do about this thing? And it's so much.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is just the way our son is wired or just maybe the 20-somethings, but he will just get onto my chart right away, even if he doesn't have an appointment for several weeks. And I recently had my annual CT scan, and I let the results sit in my chart for a good week. And in the meantime, my son had his MRI, and he immediately got on there and let me know everything's stable, but ... his surgeon is kind of lobbying to do an intervention earlier rather than later, blah, blah, blah. He's young and, he has all these reasons. So I was like, oh my gosh, maybe I should be brave. So I actually was the other day. I was brave and I read it, but of course I would have been freaking out if it wouldn't have said stable.
Right.
Yeah.
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 Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. I really hope that it does help somebody feel less fear and more hopeful about Marfan syndrome and life with it.
I hope so too. There's I'm reading a book by one of the Monty Python actors. It's always look on it's the bright side of life. And there's that funny song, always look on the bright side of life.
Yes. Oh my gosh. We used to sing that so much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again so much, Melanie.
Okay. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks for listening to this episode featuring Melanie Case sharing her story with Marfan syndrome. Next week, we'll talk to Debbie Vaughn about her experience caring for loved ones with vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or VEDS, including her late husband, who passed away not long after their son, who also has VEDS, was born. If you're ready to meet others, get involved, or need support, there are links for you in the episode show notes, as well as information on research studies for people with VEDS, Marfan, and Loeys-Dietz, including those with the VUS. If you like this show, be sure to share it on social media or give it a rating or review. You can also support the production of this podcast by joining my Patreon or by buying merch. As always, my top-tier patrons are listed in the episode show notes. If you want to be on the next season of this show, I'll be starting the interview process in September, very soon. There's a link in the episode show notes to get on the pre-interview calendar. See you soon.